Just before I begin, I want to say that the conversation today will be in Arabic. So if anybody needs translation, we have translation kits to the side. Fully Arab speaker, okay. بس كنت عم بقول الحوار رح يكون بالعربي اليوم.
I was saying that our discussions will be in Arabic, so if you need interpretation, interpretation is provided, and you can get the equipment from the back of the room. And this session is also live streamed, so people are watching us online. And if you want to follow us, it is hashtag Yemen 2018. Or even if you have any questions, my colleague will be notifying me if we have any questions from outside this room. So good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you in this meeting dedicated to Yemen. This is a very difficult moment in the modern history of Yemen. What we used to call the happy Yemen, but today we cannot call it happy Yemen anymore. There is a war by proxy taking place today in Yemen, and we'll be discussing this to see whether it is really a war by proxy in Yemen. We know that the political situation has been deteriorating, and we have also seen that the factions are the number of factions is increasing. In parallel, we have an escalating humanitarian crisis. Last year, we have mentioned cholera, and 1 million people affected by cholera. Recently, the UN issued a report mentioning that 8 million people in Yemen may be affected by famine, and thousands of children were born in the past 3 years, and 25% of these children were either prematurely born or they were born and they died within a month. And the main reason for that was the insufficient nutrition they were getting. And we know that Yemen had already very serious developmental problems even before the outbreak of these wars. And I remember that the number of children who were suffering, who were suffering from stunted growth was very high. They also have a problem with water. 45% of the people living in Sana'a did not have access to drinking water. Against this backdrop, the war erupted. And I would like now to welcome two friends and colleagues who have joined us today. Mrs. Jamila Ali Raja, who is the founder and director of a consortium focusing on politics, mass media, human rights, gender issues and development. She has a long experience in the political field in Yemen, and she has also participated in the national dialogue following the 2011 window of hope. Majid also participated in that dialogue on behalf of the youth. That national dialogue was boding well, but unfortunately it did not culminate into something tangible. Jamila is now undertaking a study on building the state. I also welcome Mr. Majid Al-Madhaji, who is the Executive Director of the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies. Majid is also an experienced researcher. He has several field works and he's been active in the political field as well. I met him when he was participating in the post-2011 National Dialogue, and I remember that he resigned in objection to the way the National Dialogue was being managed and the participation of the youth in that dialogue. I would like to start with a question addressed to both of you. Can we speak today of a war by proxy in Yemen? Can we really say that the two main opponents are the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they have control over the different factions in Yemen? And what are the new wars erupting in light of what's happening in Aden? And what are the new conflicts emerging in Aden? And what about the Saudi Emirati conflict in that city? Jamila? Is it a war by proxy? If you read the recent expert report issued in January, you know that it is indeed a war by proxy, because the report gave us evidence showing that the missiles that were launched on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia were made in Iran, and at the same time the report also shows that the mines, the maritime mines, were also locally manufactured with Iranian know-how. Those two new indicators, we had accusations and allegations in the past, but now we have evidence, and this new evidence, which shows that the missiles are modern missiles manufactured in Iran and smuggled recently, which shows that weapons are being smuggled. And this shows that the war taking place now is not purely Yemeni, it is also a war by proxy. And the first evidence was indeed the Iranian weapons being used in that war. We fear the war may expand even further, and it may have repercussions on what's happening in Aden and in the south. I will give now the floor to my colleague Majid to answer. Good afternoon. There are several levels of war and several manifestations of that war in Yemen. The first one is the external aspect, which is escalating, and the expression war by proxy is takes or goes in parallel with the internal and local dynamics. So we cannot say that there is a single level of war, but the external factor is growing in importance with time. Therefore, we in the third year are witnessing an increase in the percentage of external interference in Yemen and the control, the external control over the Yemeni factions. This is weakening the Yemeni communities, of course. We know that regional powers usually provide the cover or the umbrella that is needed, and we are witnessing an escalation in the external interference in Yemen. Even the presence of Iran is today much more obvious. So can we say that the Iranian presence is now effectively felt? But when did it start? In fact, the relationship between the Houthis and the regional support provided by Iran and the Hezbollah has always been there, but it was minimal. There was technical support and media and information support, but it is now increasing. We have a higher level of intervention. So you think that this relationship started with the Yemeni war, or it existed even before the war? Today we know that the Houthis are closest to Iran compared to what they used to be in the past. So the war and the continuation of the war led to stronger ties between them and Iran. And the weapons, or the fact that Iran was providing them with weapons, was not proven in the past. Some used to claim that boats were smuggling weapons, but we did not have any evidence in the past because the boats did not carry any flag. But now with those missiles that were launched against the KSA, it is clear that there is an obvious confrontation taking place, and it started with the launching of those missiles. This is a very important indicator, and I think that they are fully aware of what it means. This is one of the aspects of the war of proxy. The Houthis have an alliance with Iran. Therefore, the intervention of Iran will affect the dynamic of the conflict. So Iran is one of the levels of interference, and it has increased its interferences. Since the beginning of the war, we have witnessed the Iranian interventions. Then the KSA intervened with all its might, and that drew the attention of several regional stakeholders. Therefore, today we think that Iran is very happy to see the KSA drowning in the Yemeni conflict, but we know that Saudi Arabia also is changing its foreign policies, and we know also that the United Arab Emirates can now focus on their conflict with Qatar because the KSA is involved in the Yemeni war. The UAE is also active in Yemen under the same umbrella with the KSA, although they have their own agenda. We are not speaking of an early conflict, although it is obvious that the alliances between the two parties are contradictory now. So broadly speaking, we can say that the UAE is a regional stakeholder that does not only fall under the umbrella of the Arab coalition, because its agenda is much greater than the battle that is being fought by the Arab coalition. Therefore, the international or the external interventions in Yemen are today much broader and at a much higher level. So do we understand that the fact that Qatar exited that Arab coalition affected the scene? Qatar was a part of one of the active regional conflict, and therefore it took advantage of the interference of Saudi Arabia in Yemen. I think that we will witness a more active Qatari presence in supporting more polarization in Yemen to face the KSA, because Qatar has a real interest in seeing the KSA engulfed in this conflict, because the UAE will not then have enough time or a large margin to put pressure over Qatar. There are other battles, there are other axes of regional polarizations that are active and which are reverberating in Yemen. And we should also mention Turkey, and in the GCC we feel that there is a division, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and to form a front to some extent, and they are concerned with the youth ambitions that we find in the KSA, and this is what we call BMZ and the BMS, the KSA and the United Arab Emirates. Are these concerns justified? Maybe. Kuwait and Oman still have leaders from the old generation. Qatar is a special case, but on the other hand, we have new ambitions shown by the new generation of leaders. Therefore, we are saying that if there are no quick agreements made within the GCC, and if they do not use the Kuwaiti wisdom, we may start witnessing some sort of obvious conflicts within the GCC, and that would reflect negatively on Yemen. I think that we can see these differences within the GCC, but what will be the future repercussions of this in the future? This means that the attempt of Oman to launch an initiative for Yemen may not be successful. In fact, I would like to mention that Oman did not suggest any initiative. It has serious concerns vis-à-vis the KSA, and we felt that in several meetings and in several places. They are dealing with the kingdom with some kind of concern and respect, and they do not want to enter any conflict with the KSA. And they do not want to open a door with the Houthis. It started being classified as being closer to Iran and to the Houthis when they opened that door. Therefore, they have concern in this regard. Therefore, under U.S. pressure, they might accept to host the different stakeholders, especially the Houthis, who will not go to any place except to Oman to undertake talks. And that could happen under the auspices of parties that do not have a direct relationship with Oman. What are the chances of the new envoy to Yemen? We have to be cautious here, I think. The new envoy will start working on the Yemeni dossier. So let us say what are the pros and cons. We know that the UK is a member of the Security Council, and this is important because it might mean that priority will be given in the Security Council to the Yemeni issue. And Martin Griffith has worked for a very long time in mediation and in peaceful endeavors, and he works in a center for peace, so he has a good experience in this regard. And this is to be added to his record, of course. At the same time, we know that Kuwait is one of the 11 countries that are rotating in the Security Council. And here the two currents may be conflicting because of the presence of Kuwait now. But it is obvious that the situation now is more complex. And this is to be taken into account, and we have to deal with this new development cautiously. We know that things will become even more complicated, but despite all that, we have to admit that our performance is slow and ineffective with regards to Yemen and also at the regional and international levels. So I think that Martin Griffith will have to live up to a very difficult challenge. First of all, the escalation of the situation in the south, and this is a very serious recent development because the partition of Yemen and the call for secession is today very clear. Second, we have the sensitivities we find between the legitimate presidency and the Emirates. And I think that this affects the sovereignty of Yemen. And I think that Martin Griffith, in parallel to dealing with the issue of the South, will have to work on several parallel tracks. And all these tracks will need to be given the priority. He will not be able to postpone one track and focus on others. He will need to work in parallel on all these tracks, and hence the need for a very effective and experienced team working with Martin Griffith. If they do not reach any agreement with the presidency and with the Emirates, I think that we will be witnessing a very serious regression in the situation. And we will also need to reach agreements allowing us to use the existence of the GCC mission. Ben Omar and Wild Sheikh did not use the Gulf mediation at a time when they could have used it efficiently and effectively. You have a full mission that is ready to work, and you also have the Gulf Initiative, which falls under the same umbrella, but at the same time they were putting the ego of the United Nations versus the ego of the GCC, and they thought that this would harm the Yemen dignity and sovereignty. The other challenge for Martin Griffith will be to reinforce the relationship with the Yemeni mediators and mediations, whether through the Yemeni tribes or other channels. And that was completely absent in the different tracks. So this local element is extremely important, and if Martin Griffith knows how to link between the international factor, the regional factor, and the local, internal, and civil factor, then I think he will have a bigger chance to achieve something. Otherwise, I doubt he would be able to do anything. And we should not forget preparation. The stakeholders should not sit on the same table now, not at all. It's not time yet. We need a lot of preparation. We need to even the grounds with all the stakeholders, and Martin Griffith will have to understand what's taking place. I already said in a previous meeting that in the tribe and in our tribal life, when there is a conflict, people would sit together for 5 hours chewing a cud before starting to speak. And that might allow them afterwards to reach a solution. This is what I mean by preparation. He has to show that he is responsible, that he's willing to work with all stakeholders. This is what we expect from him. Finally, we can say that the two previous envoys only focused on two things: the national dialogue on one hand, and the national dialogue following the Yemeni dossier did not encompass everything. We had the governmental performance, the security issue, the economic dossier, the humanitarian dossier. Everything was neglected, and they only focused on the national dialogue. And here lies the real problem. They have neglected very important dimensions, and those were dimensions that would have supported the process and or which would support the process in the future. If we only focus on the security, inspection, etc., and if we succeed in restructuring the army, for instance, we would have built a safety net for the outputs of the dialogue. The same holds true now in the presidency now, and in the government. There are no technical bureaus assisting in the decision-making process, and they are not aware of the seriousness of taking one decision and not the other. So the presidency or the Council of Ministers do not have this comprehensive vision, and they are not undertaking any risk analysis. When someone from a certain tribe is being replaced, and we know that there are important considerations to be taken into account, we have to ask whether it is really wise to replace that person. Therefore, Martin Griffith will need to have a multi-dimensional fan, multi-track fan, and he will need an efficient, effective, and experienced working team that is well aware of the history of the conflict in Yemen in order to reach a good result. Therefore, I said that his success depends on his understanding of this fan. Majid, in comment on what Jamila said regarding the envoy, what can you say? And I would like to ask you, what about the developments which took place in Yemen after the killing of Ali Abdullah Saleh. We know that his death represents a turning point in Yemen. So can you tell us about that as well? And what are the chances of the popular conference in the post-Saleh era? Jamila is right in what she said regarding the special envoy. But I would like to add that there is a high level of regional complexities that should be taken into account. One of the levels of preparation will have to focus on the regional agreements, and these regional agreements require a political decision. And we should not pin very high hopes, or we should not focus a lot on the nationality of the special envoy, because the United Nations is a platform for signing an agreement, but we have to take into account the weights, the regional weights, and the regional dynamics, besides other local and internal factors. So can we speak of an imminent peace track in Yemen based on the nationality of the special envoy? I do not think so. But what about Yemen in the post-Saleh era? There are important stages in the history of Yemen, one of which is the killing of Ali Abdullah Saleh. He is not only a former president. We have several former presidents in Yemen, but this president gave Yemen his face, his behavior, a specific way of ruling the country, and he changed the identity of politics and the relationships between the different powers in Yemen. For 40 years, he was the most influential man in Yemen. We've had several effective people and parties and currents and movements in Yemen, but none of them had the influence of Ali Abdullah Saleh on Yemen in his personal behavior, in his personal qualifications, and also the identity he gave to Yemen, and how he created the events in Yemen which are still having repercussions up till now. All the decisions he took are still having repercussions up till now. Therefore, the heritage of Saleh is one of the most present things in the history of Yemen. The killing of Saleh is controversial because in the past 3 years, the man exercised a pragmatic policy. He shook hands with previous opponents, and this gives us a clear idea about his personality. The killing of Saleh changed a lot of things. Why was Saleh important for the war in the north of Yemen? We know that the Houthis is a group that has a confessional identity. They represent a certain religious confession, and they are limited, geographically limited in the north. And Saleh was giving them a larger umbrella. He was the only one granting a space and a presence to the Houthis by granting them alliances that would cover their presence in the coastal areas, and also alliances with the tribes that are not friendly with the Houthis. Saleh was not armed, did not have any weapons or fighters, but he had a policy, and this is what the Houthis do not have anymore. So with the death of Saleh, the Houthis lost the political tools they had, And this is decisive and vital in a country like Yemen, where weapons are extremely important in politics, but the alliances are the ones that would guarantee the possibility of using these weapons.
The Houthis lost with the death of Saleh this capacity to move freely in many regions in Yemen. And this is why the regions that were non-friendly with them revolted. In the Bayda region, for example, which is a Sunni region, and historically it wasn't friendly with the Zaydis group, hadn't been for Saleh, they would have remained in the alliance. But after that, now they started fighting with the Houthis. Now, why did the alliance forces why were they able to make advances in the West, the Ghoth and other groups? Why are they now more active? In Taz as well, battles are spreading. All this was after Saleh. Saleh did not have fighters, he had alliances. And this is what changed after his death. What's even more dangerous is what is happening in the regions governed by the Houthis specifically, where Saleh has a large number of proponents. In the far north, in the Zaydis, he also has a lot of friends and proponents. With his killing in that weight, the alliances that were joining both parties were broken. And here we can talk about the liquidity of the information. Now they want to take revenge. One of the most problem was this information on the battlefield, which was lost after the killing of Saleh. So with his death by the Houthis, the battle and the war in Yemen was changed. He had the capacity to change events in Yemen, and this strength is still very high after his death. I do not have much to comment on, but we do not have a deep state in Yemen. We had Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was deep himself. He was a deep president. He wasn't a dictator, but he knew how to use the strings of power and how to play on them. I believe that the Houthis lost, and the Gulf lost, even the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia lost with the killing of Ali Abdullah Saleh. The final remark is, with his death, did the conference come to an end as well? In my opinion, yes, it has. I believe that, to a large extent, I even say that yes, it has fully come to an end, because he was the umbrella who financed and who guaranteed that conference. With his death, the conference was divided into three entities: the popular conference with the Houthis, one with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and one which gathers between two conferences in the United Arab Emirates and in Cairo. But up until now, no one has been brave enough to say that I will be the head of the national conference. And there is no one that we consider to be competent to head it. If you remember, the Yemeni Socialist Party in the 1994 war, they were going through the weakest point, but the death of Ali Abdullah Saleh is more dangerous than what the events of 1994, when the Socialist Party was playing its role. So this is why I say that this national conference has lost, and it will not play an important role in the future political scene in Yemen. I think that the conference was made up of a network of interest, the center of which is Saleh, and who was able to manage and to run these different interests. So this common denominator was lost with the loss of Saleh. Talking about the participation on the conference and negotiations process is only a symbolic participation. Even at the level of leaderships, all leaderships are being plundered by the different members, by the different entities and parties to the agreement. Even if we're talking about the unifying the leaders, we see that the foundation is being emptied, is being voided from all power. Consequently, no one can play the role that Ali Abdullah Saleh used to play for several regions. Neither Ahmad nor Tariq can compensate for the void, political or symbolic, left by the death of Saleh. There's also some saying that there should be someone who will be prepared or trained to lead the conference, but I'm not sure that this will take place. I think that the conference has reached its final chapters, and it will remain symbolic if it remains. One last point. Forming a military power of the remains of the presidential guard could be a sustainable solution, but I do not think that this is true, because we need to prepare for it as we prepared for the transitional council. I think that the country itself will have to collect the remains of the presidential guard in the national conference. We will continue, but we do not know so far where we're heading. We know that they will not be able to protect the National Popular Conference, but they could be one of its guarantors and its protectors. We will wait what the upcoming days will unfold. I have many questions to ask you, and what you're saying is very interesting, but let me now give opportunity to the participants so that they can ask their own questions. Wait for the microphone, please. Hello, Muhammad Abu Saleh, political science teacher and PhD student in international relations. I thank you for the seminar because you were able to answer many of my questions. But what is the exit in Yemen? If we have agreements to hold elections in certain regions of Yemen, will there be an exit that would lead to a political solution in Yemen, or is it up to what Iran and Saudi Arabia agree upon? Thank you. Dr. Huda Rizk, political sociology, the Lebanese University. My first question is about Qatar. Where is Qatar today? After it broke its alliance with the Saudis and the other countries. The Houthis are true losers. With Ali Abdullah Saleh, they lost, and without him, of course, they will lose. So, I think that to say that the Houthis have lost after the killing of Ali Abdullah Saleh is exaggerated, because from the beginning, the Houthis had lost when Ali Abdullah Saleh changed sides. So would you like to answer these questions first? Very quickly. I tried to refer to the regional agreements and understandings. Of course, there should be synchronization between all of them. we would be kidding ourselves if we say we work or focus on internal agreements without paying attention to the regional agreements. Is it necessary to have a Saudi-Iranian agreement in full to solve the whole problem, especially in their relations in general, and not only limited to what is happening in Yemen? As we know, their problems is not only related to sectarian differences, but to the economy as well. They have economic interests at stake here that should be taken into account whenever we discuss any Saudi or Iranian issues. I believe that we must not wait for an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There are other types of agreements that we can depend on, conducted by Britain, the United States, the United Nations. There are exit points, especially that the price is very high. The situation today has reached a point of international embarrassment before international media and the international community. It's even a stigma in modern time humanity. The world media today and the international community are even wagering on having a future accountability for what is happening in Yemen. And this all was led by Western countries. But at the level of the Arab region, they are not thinking as far as that, but maybe with foreign pressure they will be able to work on solving the problem in Yemen and hold those involved accountable. Perhaps, but I believe that we need to take things step by step. We need to build new alliances at different levels and following different tracks. We must not focus on one regional track and then leave the local track aside. So there are balances and there are several roads that will lead to Rome. This is concerning the first question. Now, concerning the question on Qatar, I will leave the answer to you. In order not to take too much time answering. And because the Qatar issue is a bit complex. Now concerning the Houthis and that they were losing even before the death of Saleh, well, the question is, do they feel and do they consider themselves to have lost, that they are losers? This is what's important. What strengthens the Houthis today is the continuation of the war. Try to put an end to the war. You will find that the Houthis will weaken at the internal level, and they will weaken greatly. So I spread this message to the allied countries who still think that with the war they will be able to defeat the Houthis. I'll tell them, on the contrary, the war strengthens the Houthis. This is the language of war that they understand. Try to tackle the same issue from a different perspective, they will get lost. The issue of Qatar and where it is today, it is anywhere the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is not. It tries to transfer its propaganda system through Al Jazeera. They changed positions 180 degrees, and this is where we find Qatar. And now the Houthis have a media coverage where Al Jazeera highlights violations, the regions where the conflicts are taking place, and they take a lot of airtime on this. And Qatar not only has mobilized its propaganda machine, but for several other reasons, and because of the Gulf pressure, it is managing different forms of alliances that support the Houthis. There are many discourses and many narratives on the funds that are being used to fund the war. And this is part of the regional conflict between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Now Qatar is trying to work from a different angle. It is also supporting some of the Muslim Brotherhood in Yemen who are fighting the Houthis. So we can say that Qatar has several cards to play in Yemen, and it is managing each card according to a different strategy depending on its interest. To focus on the Houthis, how can we define their loss? There's a great difference in the balance of power between two entities. The allies need to have larger members and more areas under their control. And still, they were not able to achieve great results on the ground. As long as the Houthis have the capital under their control, with all of its symbolism, with all of its presence in the history and in the future of Yemen, then they can have a certain power in the war. And I can say that they have not lost, no. The Houthis also are a group who are strengthened by war activities. They live in this environment. This is part of the essence of a group that were created with weapons and with the war, and they will continue their existence as long as the war is continuing. It's a contradictory issue. How can you say that they are losers when they feel that they are not? So the Houthis did participate in the national dialogue in 2011, right? What are the lessons learned from this dialogue, and how was their participation in it? Was it a political dialogue on the future of Yemen? What was the narrative that was used then? I think that they said that there was some injustice against certain groups. Yes, let me tell you that they had complaints to make, and they entered into a struggle with Ali Abdullah Saleh. And when you are not on the side of Ali Abdullah Saleh, you can guarantee your failure. Ali Abdullah Saleh used to arm Dammaj and the Houthis as well at the same time. When they both fight, they both lose. Mohsen was in the picture as well. It is true that they joined the youth revolution in February 2011 and that they even had their own tents, and we collaborated with them. They entered the dialogue based on that, despite the fact that in the Gulf Initiative, or they did not sign the Gulf Initiative. And they're using that today. They're saying that they're trying to escape the transitional phase by saying that they did not sign the agreement. But whenever they have gains to make, they say, well, I was present in the dialogue. Their performance was good in the national dialogue. But was it part of the superficial scene at the international level? Were they thinking of the repercussions of that, and were they thinking of controlling Sana'a? I think that it's too early to judge, although then many things were laid on the table, many documents were issued. But I believe that they never expected that they will reach this far. This is my conviction. They thought that things were easy for them. They entered Sana'a without having any one fighting them. They went to Taz. No one fought against them. I think that they had an increased appetite, and they thought they're too big for their shoes. But then resistance came in Aden, and they withdrew from it in a weird manner. It's as if there was a kind of an agreement that took place under the table. Will they go back to the results of the dialogue and its outputs? Well, we truly need to analyze that. Unless some issues were revised. For example, if they agree on everything, such as the issue of the regions, they could agree on it. The Transitional Council, Hadramaut, and other regions, for them, the issue of the regions is a sensitive issue. If you speak of those who were present in the dialogue conference, they say that this issue was not on the negotiations table. There was a committee established by Mansour Hadi, and they quickly divided it into 6 regions. And the Houthis even find that they have lost in their regions. So the internal borders of the regions were not just in the opinion of the Houthis, because they are not sufficient for them to be able to provide services in these regions. I think that the issue today is all based on how we can put an end to the war as a first step, but we need to see whether the combating parties are willing to put an end to it. With the continuous bombardment and embargo and siege of the country, I don't know if this will happen. Yes, because whenever Sana'a is bombarded, the Taz follows. And the Yemeni citizen is trapped, yes. Majd, do you want to talk about the Houthis and other issues? I have a lot of to say about the national dialogue. I need a seminar all to that issue. Just let me tell you that the dialogue had distorted and maimed results. And I think that this is related to how the dialogue was managed. And one of the repercussions, it was one of the repercussions that led to the war and that paved the way to the war, because during this dialogue, the country was divided into regions, which was illogical. And this is a historical problem in Yemen, let me tell you. All bloodshed was followed by dialogue, and this dialogue led to other bloodshed. It's an international example of dialogue failure. So, and this has been the history of Yemen. I have a small comment. I believe that had the Houthis followed the outputs of the dialogue, no one would have digressed from it, because the outputs of the dialogue were excellent, and they always said that. It was a kind of a constitution, and the constitution was not or cannot be implemented in a fortnight. I think that there were political powers that were ready to revolt, because the Houthis did revolt against the dialogue. Do you have any comment? No, if I do comment, I will take too much time. Yes, I know that, because the issue of the dialogue is very broad, and how the dialogue was managed can be a lesson for us. The time frame it was set, the way it was managed and run. So there were many problems in the national dialogue, including how the delegations were formed, the security, the youth, etc. Of course, this will not be the last discussion we hold on Yemen. We will have other similar activities in the future where we will have ample opportunities to discuss this issue. Today we are commemorating the 3rd year of the Yemeni war. The fourth year of the start of the Yemeni war. We will take a second round of questions before we wrap up. Ahmed Naji, coordinator of Yemen at the Democratic Institute. I have a comment and a question. Concerning the UN envoy, I do not put high hopes on him because the state which benefited from the war in Yemen and sent weapons at more than 5 million pounds cannot have a role to play or be successful in putting an end to the war in Yemen. There's an important regional role to be played from even before the 1962 revolution. When the 1962 revolution happened, it was after the alliance of Abdel Nasser and King Faisal. So there's always a role for Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in Yemen. And this also has to do with the network of interests. There are many interests at play, and there is a complex struggle which is regional. It is a war by proxy, and we also have a struggle on the ground. 5 months ago, I went to Yemen. I moved from Sana'a to another region, and I had to go through 75 checkpoints. And at every checkpoint, I found that there are different interests at play. So we cannot read the struggle in Yemen in isolation from the interests and the motives of every conflicting entity. Thirdly, the issue of the identity. Unfortunately, religious identities, tribal identities, regional, geographic identities, all were put to the forefront. But where is the role identity? I think that identity has nothing to do with it. It is a conflict of interest par excellence. My question, will Yemen find a new alliance map? Because what we find today is an exit of Qatar from the Arab alliance. Can this hold, or can this have impact on the internal reality of Yemen? Will reform change because of the exit of Qatar? Can the Houthis take a step back because of that? Although you mentioned that we cannot go back. Will the movement be divided into several movements, and this will lead to a change in issues? I would like to hear your answers. Thank you. General Nizar Abdel Qadir, writer, researcher. I write about Yemen. My question is, to what extent will President Mansour Hadi and his government bear the weakness of these divisions in Yemen? And to what extent will the Arab Alliance countries bear the responsibility of rectifying the political situation if they truly want a military victory, or if they want to find a political solution to the situation in Yemen? Thank you. Use the microphone, please. Adil Kurtas, former Minister of Agriculture in Lebanon. I was very fortunate to be able to visit Yemen several times, working with the Food and Agricultural Organization there. My question is, don't you believe that the re-dividing of northern Yemen and the southern Yemen to be a solution to many of the problems suffered by Yemen today, as the unity of Yemen is but an emblem, but it is not true on the ground? Thank you. Heinz Mahoney, American retired diplomat. My question is about the media and the role of media in Yemen. Will the media benefit the situation in Yemen, and are there any neutral channels that could help in reaching any political settlement? Microphone, please. When I mentioned that the UN envoy comes from the UK, I said that there's a possibility that he will be beneficial, because the UK is a member of this of the UN Security Council. But it's still a probability and a possibility. Nothing is sure. And we all know that they did arm the Yemeni combatants, but this has come to an end. According to my analysis, maybe the United Kingdom could play a role in the peace discussions dossier. Concerning the different identities that were raised, this is an eternal question, and I think that it is an important question. We sometimes consider that there is one identity. We have all read Amin Malouf's book on identities. No one is made up of one sole identity. But what is the most eminent identity, and what is the collective identity that I use is an issue. In all negotiations, we call this PIN, position, interest, and needs. Identities is similar to pins, and identities can be found in needs. If we find the three different rounds, we find that the identity belongs to needs, because needs are part of your whole composition as a person. But there are also interests. Your identity is where your interests lie, and position is the last form, which is your own position, your own opinion, your fears. What are your fears? What are your ambitions in Yemen? The Houthis, for example, are afraid of their being annihilated. So they have existential fears and concerns. Are they legitimate fears or not? Here lies the question. Are they exaggerated? So there are many issues that are linked to identity that we need to touch upon, and at the same time discard ourselves from. But I think that what we need to focus on mainly is identity from the perspective of needs. I leave you to answer the question on alliances and the alliances map. And the question about the weakness by General Nizar. As to the division of Yemen, is the division of Yemen the solution? It would have been the easy way for us, but it will not be a solution. Had it been a solution, we would have followed it a long time ago. Hadramaut, for example, says that I will not go back to the south. Even the term regaining of the state or return to the state, we ask, what are we doing? Was the state in the freezer and now we will thaw it and defrost it? Is the state or what we mean by this term, the new socialist state or the regaining of the socialist state, we do not know. There were many interventions and much took place concerning interests, and these were all overlapping. Also business, religion. Many political parties, for example, now are present in the south, such as the Salafis, the Muslim Brotherhoods, the Sufis, who were even present before. They increased there. So we also have Qaeda, we also have ISIS. So we find ourselves in a big crisis, even in Mahra. Mahra doesn't want to join Hadramaut. We need to have a true dialogue. And by the way, with the National Dialogue Conference, we sometimes say that it has come to an end, so everything is put aside. Yes, but it should have been followed by many dialogues on the issues and on the details, which will lead to many complexities in the execution or the implementation of the outputs of the dialogue. So we needed to have continuous dialogue. We do not dialogue, we speak, but we do not listen, and this is our problem.
Let me tell you about alliances in Yemen. We have a liquidity of alliances in Yemen, if I may say. And in Yemen, we have an example on how wars are being managed in Yemen. We used to say that wars can be republican during the day and monarchy-related or royalty-related during the night. Let me tell you a story. 2 weeks ago, the commander of the forces of the south announced that he will undertake an alliance with Tariq Muhammad Abdullah Saleh, a former opponent of his. So it shows you clearly how forces move from extreme right to extreme left in the Yemeni war. Of course, that is related somehow to regional decisions and influences. But this is how the alliances move and change. Yemen is a country where the stakeholders have a pragmatic capacity to change their alliances. That's why we changed an alliance with the Houthis, between Saleh and the Houthis, and then the alliance with the KSA and the Houthis, who used to talk about Ali Abdullah Saleh as being a tyrant, and then they became his allies. So this is part of the alliance problematic in Yemen, its history and its developments, and we will be witnessing more changes in alliances in Yemen. The longer the war is, the more the alliances will be formed, renewed, or dismantled. Whether the new president can deal with all these problems and weaknesses, this man is bearing a lot and is not bearing anything. He is present and he is absent at the same time. So we can say that the man is absent. Therefore, everyone are taking the decisions on his behalf. So he is greatly responsible for what has happened in Yemen and for the corruption. I think that all stakeholders are responsible for what happened after 2011. They all participated in allowing Hadi to do what he is doing now. Therefore, Hadi is not alone. He is the President of the Republic. We know that the national decision was his and he should have preserved the national interests, but we have to admit that he was not alone, or she should not be alone in assuming this responsibility. Now, of course, let us not dwell on the humanitarian aspect and on the aviation crimes. Let us discuss the political responsibility, how regional forces can participate in the Yemeni war without having a clear strategy for dealing with this war. We have witnessed one of the worst forms of war management and alliance building in the world. The KSA enters the battle without having any alliances on the ground. They started building alliances after having waged their war. And this is the example how a regional force is managing a conflict in the region without having any previous alliances. And we should also take into account the conflicting interests between the stakeholders and the war itself. There are diverse strategies having to do specifically with the nature of the regional divisions. Yemen is today part and parcel of the regional conflict, which encompasses Iran, Turkey, the Gulf. And one of the hottest points is Yemen after Syria. The coalition allowed that, and the war could have been much less costly and could have not taken place at all, in fact. Regarding the coalition in Yemen, they understand what they do not want, but they do not know what they want, so they lack a vision, and here lies the danger. Regarding the partition of Yemen, this is one of the main questions. If we go back in history, before the 90s, Yemen witnessed 3 wars. So there is no stable future for 2 independent states, and among these wars there was an active regional war. We had the National Front War between the North and the South, though it's part of the nature of the interaction between the North and the South, and it's decisive and vital in making the borderline regions between them unstable. Therefore, any partition of Yemen would be another round of conflicts and wars, and any settlement based on identities will also lead to new rounds of instability in Yemen. I am Sheikh Mohammed Al-Hussein Haj from the Jafari Council.
كان عندي استفسار الحديث دائما كان عن داخل اليمن.
We always talk about the internal situation of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, etc. But I think that all these political analyses are true, but we should not separate Yemen from the external regional situation. And we think that the Yemeni problem cannot be solved internally. Do you think, this is my question, or don't you think that the Saudi war on Yemen is the result of the Iranian intervention following the change of the regime and the fact that Iran has entered Syria, has put pressure and has pushed the political tracks towards it in the region, and that was the cause why the KSA entered the war in Yemen in order to put pressure in Iran. In other words, the solution will only be Saudi-Iranian. The interference of Iran is a major component of this war. As soon as the Houthis took power, they announced 8 trips per week between Yemen and Tehran. That was one of the indicators telling us where the Houthis are going and how the relationship with Iran is going to change the face of the conflict. Of course, there are also different forms of security and military assistance. I do not have any illusions, and I am totally convinced that we should not overlook the importance of the regional dynamic and of the regional factor. We cannot overlook this factor, specifically Iran. And now we have several regional factors, and all of them are active in Yemen, including the Gulf conflict and the conflict between Turkey, Egypt and Saudi Arabia. All these conflicts are reverberating not only in Yemen but also in the Emirates, where the UAE is presenting itself as a sponsor for regional initiatives. Therefore, there are several regional levels to be taken into account. And, as I said, the regional dimension has always been present in Yemen, but it was limited, kind of. And the KSA has always considered that Yemen is very important for its interests. We will finish now with the first part of our meeting, and we will move to the second session, which will be moderated by my colleague Farah Al-Muslimi. I would like to thank you for your attention, for your questions, and I thank Jamila and Majid for highlighting many complex issues. I have mentioned that we took the decision to focus more on Yemen, so you can expect further activities and meetings on Yemen. We now move to the second session with my colleague Farah Al-Muslimi.
يلا ما تحكي اوكي بس فينا نسيب شو طيب قلبوا لهنا مرحبا فينا نبلش
Good afternoon.
مرحبا شكرا مجددا.
Good afternoon. I thank you for being here. I am Farah al-Muslimi and I am a Yemeni researcher. I would like to welcome you in this session. And in this session, we will try to cover what Jamila and Majid did not tackle. So we will try to dwell on the details of the Yemeni issue. And we will try to focus on what happened recently in Aden, on the situation of the terrorist and armed groups in Yemen, and what we are expecting for Yemen with the new U.S. administration, and what are the repercussions of this administration and on the Yemeni conflicts, and how the Yemeni conflicts will affect the U.S. priorities. This session is important because there are several axes we find now in Yemen, and we can discuss Yemen and the Yemeni conflicts from several perspectives. The first thing we have to take into account is the fact that the honeymoon is over between all the stakeholders in Yemen. The situation or the honeymoon ended between Saleh and the Houthis, and also the one between the other local factions, and the end of the honeymoon between the regional powers. We know that Qatar exited the coalition, and at the same time there is an emerging Emirati-Saudi conflict in Yemen. So I would like to welcome the participants. We have with us Hussam Radman, who's a writer, researcher specialized in armed groups in Yemen, and I recommend you to read his most recent report dated 2017. He comes from Aden, and he will be giving us an overview of the most recent battle there. And we also have with us Yamin Al-Yafi'i, who is a researcher and a writer specialized in the south of Yemen. He will be highlighting the opportunities of the Transitional Council, the challenges faced by that council, and the potential future of the south. And to my right, I have Sama, who will be discussing the role of the United States in the Yemeni conflict, what are the priorities of President Trump with regards to Yemen, and whether we can expect any changes with regards to the U.S. policy in Yemen. Hussam, can you tell us what has happened recently? A week ago we had a battle. Was it surprising to the outer world alone, or were there repercussions in Aden? And after that we can discuss the Salafis and the Al-Qaeda. What happened in Aden was actually an armed conflict which started as a political conflict between legitimacy on the one hand and the South movement on the other hand. It started with the resignation of Al-Zubaydi in April 2017. This led to a movement in the south and pulled the south away from the legitimacy. And this is when the South Transitional Council was created, and confronting the Yemeni legitimacy represented by the presidency and the Reform Party and other Yemeni parties. So this is not a bilateral conflict where one wants to impose its will over the other. This is a multi-dimensional, multi-parties and multi-level conflict. We have, of course, the Transitional Council and legitimacy, but we also have the Emirates versus the KSA. And in the most recent conflict, Mr. al-Zubaydi tried to change the rules of the political game. And in his declaration, he tried to change the rules of the political conflict. He said that he will be supporting the popular resistance in the north, but he wants a change of the government. This was not a precedent. He had suggested that in October of last year. But they thought that he was joking because tens took to the streets at the time, and nothing occurred on the political level. But al-Zubaydi recently issued a statement as being the leader of the southern opposition. He wore his military uniform and decided to change the rules of the game. And following that, he was capable of changing the balance of power on the ground. But he could not change the political game because he could not change the government and he could not impose the partnership that the legitimacy was not accepting. On the other hand, we know that the legitimacy completely lost on the military level in Aden. Therefore, they tried to preserve themselves politically and to put pressure on the Transitional Council by using the strong mediation of the KSA. The Emirates think that they have achieved their goals out of this escalation. The KSA was embarrassed because suddenly the legitimacy was shaky. But on the other hand, they won because these events created a competitive environment, and everyone wanted to please Riyadh because Riyadh was the way to power or to influence. So on the second day after the escalation, we found the commander of the opposition of the south present on the field, and there was also a rapprochement between Tariq Saleh and al-Zubaydi. On the other hand, al-Islah tried to approach the KSA, and they said that Al Jazeera's role in covering the events was a negative role. Therefore, they admitted that Riyadh was the way to exercise political influence. When we say Salafis, we mean by that all the currents and the forces adopting the extremist Sunni ideology in the interpretation of the state and of the society. The Salafis in the south were in two parts, the ideology and the jihadis, but with time they merged. So now we have two formulas of jihad. We have an oriented jihad, which we call the popular opposition, which is the Salafi movement, which expressed itself through resistance. And we have the other Salafi movement represented by Al-Qaeda, which is part of the international jihadi movement. And this jihadi movement does not identify itself away from the coalition. They put themselves as part of the legitimacy and of the coalition, and they are not a coherent state. They are still a liquefied state, and they are the result of the southern community, which was pumped with the Salafi ideology and Wahhabi ideology on one hand, and a result of the polarization and of the Houthi interference. And this is what led to the existence of the current Salafi movement. As I said, it is still a liquefied state, and they do not have any global objectives. They are based on an ideological confessional belonging, and they cannot position themselves outside the Yemeni legitimacy. They do not have a clear organization. Therefore, we find that most of them are called with the name of their leaders. So we are facing a liquefied state, and all the parties are trying to use them to face al-Islah on one hand, or the Houthis on the other hand, and many Salafi councils have been part of the efforts undergoing or now to fight terrorism. We do not know what will become of them in the future, but they are the prevailing current now in the south as a result of the historical events since '94, and also as a result of the geographic and social conditions there. The Salafis are the Salafis. They do not adopt a polarized perception. Therefore, you are dealing here with leaderships having changing belongings. The Salafis that are now with the Emirates or with the KSA, we cannot say that there is a Salafi movement adopting one ideology and another adopting another ideology. There are a lot of similarities, but they do not have a position towards politics, but some of these Salafi leaders have political ambitions. Therefore, they would like to exercise this ambition by showing their political and military potentials, and some have a different agenda, like those fighting in Saada or in the northern coastal areas. What is Al-Qaeda doing? Here we are talking about the independent Salafis having an approach and strategic goals. And there are a lot of similarities between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Both of them are suffering a regression today because the strategic environment has changed greatly as a result of several factors. First of all, Al-Qaeda today has an existential crisis at the international level in its branches, in its leadership, in its ideology and its strategy. Will it be attacking the US or Israel, or should it attack the Shiites? And this has repercussions on the Yemeni situation. And let us take ISIS as well. We know that ISIS is at a turning point now. They are moving from being a state to being a group or an organization again. They have sustainable funding sources and we know that the tribes in Yemen do not support Al-Qaeda, but the presence of the Houthis is considered as a joint fear or concern. Now, regarding the jihadi map, it has changed. The golden era was between 2015 and 2016, and suddenly after 2011, Al-Qaeda moved from its fortresses to its safe havens, and after 2015, they moved from the safe havens to the vital cities, and mostly Al-Mukalla city and Aden. In 2016, and thanks to Abu Dhabi and the Southern Movement, which is its ally, these cities were liberated from the jihadi organizations, whether in Al-Mukalla or in Aden. Al-Qaeda repositioned itself and withdrew from any direct confrontation. They went back to their safe havens. So the jihadi map changed again. Al-Bayda, Lahaj, Abiyan, Shabwa, Taiz, and Marib. After 2016 and during 2017, the strategic environment changed. And we have to mention that the existence of these groups is not the core of the problem. It is one of its results. And therefore, when the political void was filled and when the military institutions that were created started being fortified and empowered, those groups went back to their natural size or weight. And we saw that safe havens were taken away from Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda was restricted to parts of Al-Maghrib province. And in the most recent attack, this was obvious. Since the beginning, ISIS was not a part of the Yemeni historical development. ISIS could not present itself as a protector of the Sunnis, as it happened in Iraq. And the local communities did not allow ISIS to control large geographic areas. And ISIS could not inherit Al-Qaeda as happened in Syria. Therefore, ISIS was a limited phenomenon. There was a confrontation between them and Al-Qaeda at the beginning, and a confrontation between them and many social forces. Today, their current strategy shows that they have preferred to withdraw to safe havens. They have moved from competition to accumulation. They want to attract supporters to enhance their military and financial position, and they have decided to isolate themselves. They have been avoiding massive or large-scale attacks they used to undertake in the past, and also they decided to isolate themselves geographically in some very remote mountainous regions. Now they are only trying to rebuild themselves, and they know that the current contradictions, whether locally or regionally, are about to change, and these groups thrive on chaos. I will go back again to the chances of the Transitional Council, but before that I would like to know what you think of Trump's priorities. What is the assessment of the U.S. now regarding what's happening now in Yemen?
أهلا.
Good afternoon. How are you? First of all, I would like to thank Carnegie Middle East Center for their kind invitation and the participants. Allow me to apologize for my weak Arabic, and also because I am recovering after a strong flu. Concerning Trump, let us realize that President Trump is an extraordinary aspect of the U.S. regime. He is different from Obama at the surface, but concerning the policies regarding Yemen, he is very similar to Obama because they follow the perspective of combating terrorism. Furthermore, he even made the drone operations even more intensive. They have reached 79 in number. Trump decreased the target points, meaning now bombardment is more random and they do not take civilians into account. These are the similarities. As to the differences, we have many differences. The Trump government is easier to understand. We can also say that Trump likes to work with the American army and he has a great interest in security. He likes to be strong to defeat terrorism in speech and in action. And not also in Trump as a person, but also with the U.S. envoy, Nikki Haley. She presented before the international community a weapon that she stated is Iranian. And so we see that the United States has had a strong alliance with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This alliance is much stronger from that was from the Trump government. Trump went to Saudi Arabia and he saw in the King and President Sisi an emblem and a symbol of strength in the region. So we can say as well that the U.S. is against Iran in its political discourse at least, and it wants to show the Houthis, or in its war, in the war in Yemen, it wants to show that this war is regional, and thus they will go against the Houthis. And we can also say that President Trump is interested in the humanitarian situation more than the Obama administration did. This is based on my interviews with humanitarian organizations in the United States. They said that the current government is listening to humanitarian issues much more than before, and they want to help the Yemenis more. If we look at the seaport of Hudaydah, during the Obama administration and towards its end, Hudaydah was a red line that Saudi Arabia cannot approach. During Trump administration now, we see that the United States is back and it has its own cranes set in the Hudaydah seaport, and they helped for the aid to enter Yemen. This aid came from the United States, but some aid also came from other countries, and thus the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had to extend the period of aid import until Saudi Arabia will directly or will allow for direct aid. The declarations of President Trump on the humanitarian situation is much stronger in terms of language used compared with that of Obama. In addition, President Trump's declaration of Jerusalem as a capital of Israel weakened the role of Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in Yemen. What I mean by that is that the strongest declaration on Yemen was done during the same time he declared Jerusalem a capital of Israel, which gave more interest and power in his declaration towards Yemen. It's as if, and also we see that Trump or even Obama sacrificed Yemen for having a transaction or an agreement with Iran. And the same thing can happen with Trump. The role of the Congress is very important. The U.S. Congress has now been revived. It has woken up from its slumber recently. Now it understands the situation in Yemen. Several times they have tried to ask the President on the role of the United States in Yemen. So the United States today is participating in the war one way or another. It provides the alliance forces fuel. It conducts air raids in Yemen under the emblem of combating terrorism. They have trainers and advisors in the Gulf who are assisting the alliance in defining targets and through other ways as well. So the U.S. Congress wants to speak about the decision of war of 1973. They want to talk about this law which was issued after the Vietnam War, which states that the United States or the American president must take the approval of Congress before participating or waging any war. Last year, they took this decision to vote, and they had, or they still needed 3 votes in order to enter. I think that the peace lobby will have to play an important role to repeat the same experience. But this will not change the position of the United States towards Iran, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, or Yemen. The only thing is to send a message to the world that the war in Yemen is a war that the American people do not want to take part in. And the repercussions of war in Yemen will decrease because the planes that are fueling the combatants will not be present, which means lesser air raid, lesser bombardment. And in this way, the United States will have made an important message delivered to the world. I will go back to you, but I know that the Council has had an office in Washington, but does it have an office in Hadramaut or in Mahra? What are the opportunities of this Council? They want to have more dialogue inside Yemen, in the south of Yemen specifically. Since the beginning of the end of the Socialist Party, they were claiming that. And to what extent is this a result of the absence of certain interests, and what are their opportunities in the south? Can they present themselves as an intermediary for the South or an exclusive agent for the South? And what are the opportunities of their political sustainability, taking into account the different landscape of the South and the great motivations that we see from abroad? Good afternoon. The Transitional Council is a part of the southern forces of different intellectual and social background. As Hussam said while discussing the events in Aden, the Transitional Council was established in May 2017, and it came as a result of several factors. How does this force come to be? What were the forces that created this Transitional Council? First, the main power was because of the movement in the South. when an important leader, al-Naqib, who started in 1994 after the end of the war between the North and the South, opposing the Ali Abdullah Saleh regime. Then they formed armed groups, but they did not succeed. He continued in his struggle until he became a symbol of the Transitional Council today. So he benefited from the capital of the Southern movement. The second component is Hani bin Break and the Salafis. Hani bin Break wanted and since he was not part of the movement and he did not participate in the protests and demonstrations, he wanted to have a new position. He belonged to Muqbil al-Wadi'i group, which believed in appeasing the leader, and they are not politically oriented at all. So does Hani bin Breki represent a balanced bloc inside the Transitional Council? So is the Salafi group that follows him loyal to the Transitional Council and its decisions? Based on our previous experience, we know that they prefer to be apolitical. As Salafis, yes. Microphone. So they do not represent the geographic identity, because in the south we find a specific geographic definition. So how can the Salafi work in that? Salafism is very complex in Yemen. How did it develop there, and why is Hani bin Breka today a representative of the Southern opinion, although they were very apolitical? After bin Wada'i, he became the first reference for the Salafis. After his death, there was a discord between his main students on who to represent this reference, and there was a division in the positions in the south. When the Houthi movement started in the north, and it started to gain popularity, the Salafi positions in the south tried to decrease their opposition. They tried to secure themselves because they weren't as popular compared to the popularity of the Houthis in the north. But when the Houthis came to Sana'a, the Salafis that were in the north held agreements with the Houthis, and these Salafis had to succumb to reality, which is to defend the south, because Houthi was a danger for them. When he reached the south, he wanted to target these groups, and he declared that openly. Another component is tribal and different social backgrounds. When the war erupted, everyone was provoked. Even those from the south, they believed that this is a new movement. They carried the slogan of reviving the South state, and they have other incentives that allowed them to enter into that struggle and to fight. The Salafis as well had an ideological dimension. And then came the United Arab Emirates, and no one mentioned this law because the UAE is the only Arab entity that entered directly in the south and in the war through the south. They fought there. Emirati soldiers were with the Salafis combating the Houthis in the battlefield. When the war ended and the Houthi forces were deposed, there was an agreement between the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on legitimacy, and this led to a partnership between the forces that fought in this battle and legitimacy. What happened after that, the size of the contradictions inside this alliance, especially between Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, was very high, to the extent that it led to pressuring legitimacy towards escalation against the Emirates and against the participation of those who were considered to be allies of the United Arab Emirates. And after taking aside groups that were considered to be allies of the United Arab Emirates, the Transitional Council was formed, and the UAE adopted it in order to defend its existence or its interests in Yemen, or even its share of the plunders of the war. In the complex and complicated regional situation, it is very difficult to say, because the Transitional Council is under establishment and they have several challenges that they need to overcome, such as their relationship to legitimacy, whether they are legitimate or not. And this is not a simple issue because of the many overlapping political, social, and economic and regional complexities. And the two entities that lead the Arab Alliance. The challenges are that in the south, after the war, the security and military forces used to follow Ali Abdullah Saleh, and when the liberation was made, they participated with the south, and the security and military institutions there were very simple and weak. This radical change from lack of order to order was a great challenge. And how will these divisions be re-institutionalized with institutions that will take regulatory or administrative character, in addition to a national character, far from these social contradicting blocks? The attempt of Zabidi, is it similar to the attempt of Kurdistan or south of Kurdistan? Neither this nor that. Mr. Obaidi and the Transitional Council do not represent any turning point in the conflict, but in the southern movement itself, or the Salafi movement, which we are trying to understand in the south. They are contradicting in terms of content, but they are very similar in form. Both have an identity tendency, and they are both populistic. Now, the Transitional Council is a turning point in the south because they were able to improve this populistic intensity with clear tendencies and targets. But has the Transitional Council completed its internal transformation? They haven't asked many major questions. They haven't answered them: who we are, what do we want, where do we want to go. Will we see the Transitional Council staying on top of the trees, or will they go down to the grassroots to participate in the Yemeni conflict? will the Council work on enhancing the South identity, facing accepting the project of the 6 regions, whether voluntarily or involuntarily or coercively, or will they impose the 2-region option as a compromise? They still haven't answered all of these questions. The Southern Movement cannot claim that they are representing the South exclusively, but they have a better social and political opportunity in the Southern political sphere. But what will the future options be? How will they move? Will they have more alliance with the UAE or what? And it's still too early to answer these questions because we see many transformations that are sometimes misleading. Now we open the floor to your questions. My main condition is for you to have 1-minute interventions as a maximum due to lack of time, and wait for your microphone. We will take a few questions and we will try to divide them in a way where our speakers will answer them productively. Microphone.
اتفضل، احنا تقريبا نسمع صوتك اذا بدك.
Microphone, please. We apologize for not interpreting. We cannot hear the speaker as he's not using the microphone.
الاقتصاد اليمني مبني على المساعدات الخارجية وعلى اليمنيين الموجودين في الخارج. أنا حتى في نيويورك مثلا وجدت يمنيين موجودين عم يبعثوا الفلوس تبعهم لأقاربهم في اليمن. أنا بتساءل إنه أمام هذا الصراع السياسي اللي تفضلوا فيه إنه الوضع الاقتصادي باليمن تحسن أو رجع لورا؟
سؤال ثاني؟
A second question. Thank you very much. I have a question to Hussam. You mentioned Abu Dhabi and its role in combating Qaeda. You mentioned that twice.
تكون الجماعة
If the Salafi groups refuse to respond to the orders of Abu Dhabi, what will happen? If they do not join the Abu Dhabi project, what will happen? My second question. Within the mystery in the Transitional Council and the great support they have from the United Arab Emirates, can UAE use the Transitional Council as a ticket where it can make many political transactions and achievements? Thank you. My question is to Dr. Sama. In your opinion, what is the experience of the U.S. administration towards Yemen, and what can the Houthis do at this stage in order to improve their image before the U.S. administration in order to make better strides towards peace? So what's the opinion of Washington? And the second question on Abu Dhabi is addressed to you. In my opinion, the United States does not care for the Yemeni government. It deals with the Yemeni government, or it deals with the Saudi Arabia directly, and it refuses the role of Iran in Yemen. Other than that, it doesn't see any active or realistic role for the Yemeni government. The Yemeni president has met the American president when Trump visited Saudi Arabia. Other than that, they do not see any effective role of the Yemeni embassy in Washington or in New York. The U.S. is now focusing on the proxy war and on combating terrorism specifically. If the U.S. embassy plays a role in Yemen, it's very limited because the U.S. ambassador does not reside in Yemen. He is neither in Sana'a nor anywhere else in Yemen. And I think that a new American ambassador will be appointed, and she will reside in Jeddah until the end of the war in Yemen before she moves there. The only role could be diplomatic, and it could be through appointing an American citizen in the position or at a certain position of OCHA in the United Nations. What is the relation between Transitional Council and the United Arab Emirates? Well, the relationship is very confusing. It's complicated. Yes, because the Transitional Council found itself to be weak before the alliances between other parties. And this is why they're trying to search for an external ally as a kind of protection for it, and in order to avoid many problems. And since it's a new council, and since it's a new power that emanated in the south, and since it has strong relations with the UAE, they gain some kind of authority and power from the United Arab Emirates. What's important to know is whether the United Arab Emirates will actually go towards implementing the aspirations of the Transitional Council or not. And if the United Arab Emirates does not do that, the Transitional Council will find itself in a deadlock. It's an embarrassing relationship, to say the least, because it exceeded all forms of alliances between entities who should be allies. You spoke about the thin line that differentiates between Qaeda and the Salafis. Until now, it's a transit from the jihad, considering many Salafi groups trying to target their jihad towards the Houthis, and vice versa as well. It could be because of certain regional and local circumstances. These Salafis could go back to an international jihad. So it's confusing. In fact, in the US, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in even Turkey, in Iran, no one adopts a reform vision to combat extremist Salafis. They try to combat terrorism, but not jihadists or Salafists. And thus, combating them must not take only military reform, and it must tackle the roots of this violence. Next time, we will make sure that we will have a session specific on the economic interest, and I do share your concern as well. And the recent legal amendments are much more dangerous than the war, and they will kill families more than what the wars have done. It's a strike on the Yemeni economy when Yemeni workers were kicked out from the Gulf. And this is the same problem that history is repeating. I give you the floor to ask the question, and then you, and then you. And please use the microphone. Could you please introduce yourself? Asil Tabbara, journalist. A comment on the Transitional Council. It may be a naive question. Why does the United Arab Emirates support the Transitional Council? And they are in contradiction or in opposition with the Saudi Arabia by doing so, right? Another question, after the battles that took place 2 weeks ago, what did the Transitional Council achieve? Because they had demands then. Did they achieve them? My name is Abdullah Rafiq. I address my question to Hussam since he is an expert on jihadists. We heard about establishing a school that is being established in Al-Mahra Governorate. What is your interpretation of this project and who supports it? General Nizar Abdel Qadir. Any problem in the world, if we look at history in the last millennium, if we do not find any agreement between the major forces to solve the problems of any region in the world, then this problem will not be solved. The second condition for solving a problem is for all internal entities party to the armed conflict to end their wars. The most recent example we can give is Bosnia. All entities were depleted, their strengths were depleted, and there was a political will. Milosevic was the only one whose forces were not depleted. The Americans air raided him, and then they were able to come up with a solution. So, can we in Yemen see the same thing happening in the near future? Or aren't there any international interests to pressure all entities to come up with a solution? We know that wars continue because they provide interest, no matter how limited, to any political entity, to any tribe, to any ideological group, or to a certain organization. This is why I think that the war will continue because of these interests, and this will lead Yemen to disperse into and divide into levels much smaller than the levels of the tribe, that may reach the level of the family even. And the war will continue on fronts that are dispersed without having any military effort to break the others in order to impose a solution. So the question is, where is Yemen heading to? Microphone. It may seem a simple question, but it's an important question. So why are they in alliance with the UAE? And what did the Transitional Council achieve? It seems that it has lost. And can the United States and Russia come to an agreement on Yemen, for example? Is Yemen easier than Syria when it comes to a solution? Because it seems that there is an international agreement on that. Can it be built? Can we answer all of these questions? We'll start with that on the Transitional Council. Has it lost or failed? Can I, since he comes from Aden, can he answer that question instead of me? Well, at the military level, well, things have come to a solution, but it's much more complex. For the United Arab Emirates, it is very clear that it wants to become a regional power that has interests in Yemen due to Yemen's important strategic position, which overlooks major trade routes and channels, and doesn't want others to use Yemen as a tool against it. And by others, I mean Qatar specifically. As to the question on can the Yemen problem be solved, the problem in Yemen is much more complex when it comes to foreign interference. In these countries, there are two main entities, and there are allies, such as in Syria. But in Yemen, we have 5 entities, 5 parties, each with their own vision. And some of them do not even have a vision. They do not have any horizons after the war. So this is why I think that the Yemeni situation is much more much more difficult than other dossiers.
In Al-Mahra, we had a movement of displacement from the north to the south, and the south, of course, is their logical shelter, and in Al-Mahra there was a social rejection of this issue, and I think that they were also affected by the regional conflicts. What was the second question? Why is the Emirates an ally of the Council? In Yemen, up till now, there are no agreements leading to a solution, and the truth is there are no agreements on which we can build the war among the allies themselves. Therefore, they started with the resignation of Bahah to that of al-Zubaydi. So they were pushing out certain forces out of the political representation, and they are trying to build alliances with the social component, which gives it a certain form of legitimacy. Is there one party serving the other? I do not think that the relationship is that way. We are still below that level, but there are common interests, mutual interests. We can say that there is a strategic relationship because the Yemeni scene is chaotic and ambiguous. But I think that there are mutual interests, and if the mutual interests were not there, the Council would not be serving the other party if that other party does not guarantee it a minimal level of interests. Do you think that it will be easier to agree on Yemen compared to the agreement on Iraq? Sorry, but they did not use the microphone. Now I would like to comment on the issue of the South. I think that the alliance between the Emirates and the Transitional Council is due to the fact that the Emirates feel that they have sacrificed more than Saudi Arabia in the Yemeni war, and their presence on the ground gives them the impression that they should have a stronger part in decision-making. And I think that that movement was a show of force by the Emirates against the KSA, stating that we do not want the Muslim Brotherhood. We'd rather deal with our allies among the Salafis or the Southern movement. Therefore, I think that the Emirates refuse the presence of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I think that this conflict is very simple, and it will not undermine the alliance between the KSA and the Emirates. As for the USA and Russia, on the surface, I do not think that the USA will enter an alliance, an overt alliance with Russia, simply because of the probe going on in the United States regarding the potential interference of Russia in the U.S. elections. Other than that, I think that the global community, and whether we mean by that the US or the UK, can put pressure on the different allies in Yemen in order to reduce the famine, because both the US and the UK are now in a very embarrassing situation. Human rights organizations have shown the US and the UK in a very embarrassing and shameful image by highlighting their role in the famine in Yemen. Now, whether Yemen is more complicated than Syria or not. We know that the areas of fighting are more limited. And what you said, General, is true. It's very painful to see our country in this situation, but the global community can push for peace. It's also obvious that the US-Russian agreement can tackle very simple humanitarian assistance, but the strategic decision to end the war hasn't been taken yet. Any other questions? Microphone, please. Microphone, please. The mic is not on. Any other questions? I would like to ask Hussam about al-Zabidi in his most recent position. And he asked for the respect of the southern decisions. What are the reactions of the people of the south with regards to his most recent declaration? Is it really possible, do you think that the coming alliance in the future can be between the Houthis, the reform? I think that this alliance will be based on the existence of a common enemy and also a common sponsor, which is the United Arab Emirates. What was the reaction of the people of the South? I did not feel that they were rejecting this in general, but up till now, we haven't discussed clearly the shape, the scope, the levels of this alliance, and whether it will lead to a united force between the two parties or not, whether there will be areas for training. So until now, the image of this alliance is not clear, but I think that the clearer the picture becomes, and as long as the alliance does not lead to benefits to the South, it will be rejected by the people. Do you think that the US can intervene militarily in a more direct manner in Yemen? Anything is possible, of course, but this has been debated at the beginning of the Trump mandate on January 29, 9 days after he took office. He decided to enter an operation in Yemen. It was a failure, because the operation was intercepted by Al-Qaeda, and the Americans killed a lot of civilians in Yemen, including women and little children. After that, President Trump announced that the operation was a success, and the U.S. Congress and Senator McCain, who is a Republican as well, doubted that operation, and so the U.S. public opinion was against that operation because they lost an American soldier and the cost of the losses was very high. So after this first experience in Yemen, I think that it was obvious that the U.S. has failed. Trump wanted to have a strong name in Yemen, just like Mohammed bin Salman, but he learned very quickly and he decided not to intervene in Yemen directly, and he left this dossier to the channels in the White House. He gave them that dossier and decided to withdraw himself. And we know that the U.S. undertook several operations on the ground, but we have no details on these operations. But anything is possible, as I said. Any other questions? Microphone, please. We are seeing the elite forces in Hadramaut and in other areas. What is the stance of KSA in this regard? Are there differences or a conflict between KSA and the United Arab Emirates? When the KSA thinks of Yemen, they only remember that there are 450,000 common borders, while the Emirates have no common borders between them and Yemen, while Saudi Arabia is stuck with this geographic reality. Therefore, they have no illusions about it. The Emirates can be creative in that regard. But this is, of course, theoretical. And but we have to admit that that there is a major difference between the Saudi perception and the Emirati perception of the Yemeni conflict. And the Transitional Council was a movement against the government, but it also touched Saudi Arabia. Therefore, what is the relationship or the nature of the relationship on the ground and in the south specifically? There isn't a major conflict between them. Microphone. So there's a difference because the Saudi Emirati intervention did not carry with it a clear political vision of how to manage the internal contradictions. And in order to avoid the contradictions, the Emirati did two things. First of all, building political and military balances that would guarantee on the long run their presence in Yemen and also their participation in any potential solution. Second, the total commitment to the goals of the Arab coalition through confronting the Houthis. So there is a possibility of joint management of the situation as long as this relationship does not undermine the Arab coalition based on confronting the Houthis and securing the Red Sea from any Iranian presence and securing the Yemeni coastal areas and fighting terrorism, which would reduce the pressure put by the U.S. on the KSA. Therefore, there are commonalities that are greater than the differences that we may find, and this was obvious in the most recent battle in Aden, where both parties understood that they have to put pressure on the stakeholders, and that was done. And so they have put pressure on the Transitional Council in order to put an end to these operations, and then with the sponsorship of the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, a truce was established, and it is still holding up till now. So the contradictions the major contradictions are on the Yemeni internal levels. Yes, but what about the future of these groups in any political or non-political process? This is the difficult question. As we said, Zabidi is a symbol for all these forces, and it is the only personality from the south being accepted by all the regions of the south. But these military forces are being paid by the coalition and by the Emirates. Can the Transitional Council provide the necessary financial resources and pay all these people in order to control their decision? Microphone, please. Microphone. Apologies, but the mic is not on. It is still ambiguous. Many operations were done by ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but I do not know whether it's a conflict between different forces. It's not clear until now. And as a journalist, I do not have enough evidence to form a clear idea. I would like to thank you for this session, and on behalf of you, I would like to thank our guests, and we hope to have other meetings in the coming month in Beirut. I would also like to thank those who have joined us electronically through the live streaming, and I thank all those who have contributed to the success of this meeting, and I specifically thank the two interpreters for their assistance. We hope to see you very soon. Thank you.